Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, or in some cases, I guess it might still be good morning. And welcome to our webinar focusing on approved and investigational treatments for ATTR amyloidosis, both hereditary and wild type. All of our previous webinars can be viewed on the webinar section of our website, amyloidosissupport.org, and on our YouTube channel. The this webinar should be available up there maybe a week or two, maybe less. First, let me say that our heart, thoughts, and prayers go out to everyone in the affected areas of Los Angeles. We're thinking of you, and we're just extending our hands out to you. So it's so hard for us to say much. Words just don't express it, but know that we care. In the control room today, we have our executive director, Paula Schmitt, and we have our special projects director, Bob Gibson.
Good afternoon.
Questions that were sent in ahead of time will be answered first by our panel during the Q&A session after the presentation. We've set aside a whole hour for questions because we never have enough time. And even though we probably still won't have enough time for all the questions that have come in, and there'll be more typed in at the Q&A section, we will ask our panelists to answer them in writing, and we will share the responses with all of you. The chat portion has been disabled, but there will be occasional useful items popping up there posted by Paula. Our esteemed panelists today include Dr. Shafiq Karam from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Farooq Sheikh from Georgetown MedStar, Dr. Brett Sperry from St. Luke's in Kansas City, and Dr. Rick Ruberg from Boston University. Dr. Ruberg has a minor conflict, but he will be here for the Q&A. You'll be seeing our brilliant doctors that I just mentioned at some in-person meetings coming up, as well as other faces that we all know and love. We're so grateful to all of our doctors for willing to give up their time for us. Our meeting calendar on our website tells us that we have a meeting coming up in LA on February 15th. Another meeting coming up March 15th is our first meeting in St. Louis. And on April 5th, there'll be a meeting in the Fairfax, Virginia area. More details on that meeting will be following soon. We're also working on meetings in several other cities, including Philadelphia. And as soon as we have details, we will put them up on our website and Facebook groups. Of course, the all ATTR meeting, in which we hold every other year, will be happening in Chicago on the weekend of October 24th, 25th, and 26th. Bob, can you put up the QR code so that if anyone wants to take a picture of that? Okay, we also have a link for it on our website. You can always email me at Muriel@amyloidosissupport.org about more information about that meeting. We do urge you to register and book your hotel soon. The event and all the meals are at no charge, and we got an exceptional hotel rate of $139 a night, which is really super for the Chicago area, probably a lot of areas, right? But you're going to have to save your pennies for the airfare for sure. In 2023, we had 500 patients, caregivers, physicians, and pharma at this event. And with all the new treatments and research happening, it's more important than ever that we all stay informed. Okay. For more information on that meeting or anything else, don't hesitate to email. There will be a brief survey when this meeting is over, and we ask that you take the time to fill it out. Should you have to leave early, please fill it out when you leave. It is important to us, and it will help us in developing future webinars. We'll be working off our treatment chart today, and Bob will put that up on your screen for reference. You can feel free to email me for a copy at Muriel@amyloidosissupport.org. Okay. So now we will have our first presenter, Dr. Farooq Sheikh. Dr. Sheikh, take it away.
Muriel, thank you so much, and thank you to the ASG for this invitation. What a privilege to be with you on a Saturday and with my esteemed colleagues. Let's see if I can share my slides. So once again, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Over the next 15 minutes, I have the daunting task of describing the changing landscape of treatment, specifically disease-modifying therapies for ATTR-CM. So in order for us to have this discussion, we must begin with a brief understanding and review of the pathophysiology of the disease. Shown on the left is the liver, where 90% of the protein transthyretin, which we fondly call TTR, is produced. And this protein exists as a tetramer, 4 parts that are very similar and has a certain structure, 3-dimensional, actually 4-dimensional structure. But through either the aging process or through a genetic substitution, there's dissociation of this protein, which goes through a series of folding steps, which unfortunately forms amyloid fibrils, resulting in heart disease and peripheral neuropathy. But through the advent of new technologies that have really changed the landscape of the treatment for our patients, we have now learned that we can inhibit and prevent the production of the protein by targeting the messenger RNA, a precursor of the protein, through knockdown using RNA silencing agents, which we're going to talk about, vutrisiran, and then recently the second approved therapy in this category, known as acoramidis, a TTR stabilizing drug. But we're going to begin our discussion with tafamidis, first in class, first FDA-approved treatment for this disease. And we will realize over this conversation over the next 15 minutes that our treatment selection for our patients will depend on the cardiac phenotype, the neurologic state, whether there's hereditary disease and wild-type disease and/or wild-type disease, and obviously the cost and availability, but most importantly, the preference of our patients. So let's begin with tafamidis, first drug ever approved for the treatment of this disease. Well, the pivotal trial that led to this, known as the ATTR-ACT or ATTR-ACT trial, randomized patients in this structure where 441 patients were enrolled in a clinical trial, and 3 out of every 2 patients received the treatment, tafamidis, a transthyretin stabilizing drug, preventing the dissociation of the TTR protein, and then therefore preventing amyloidogenesis. Patients were randomized to either the drug or to a placebo. And the primary data endpoint was a risk of all-cause mortality, of dying during the study period, or a cardiovascular-related hospitalization. And there were some secondary endpoints related to functional capacity and quality of life. And what we learned in this trial, now published in the New England Journal, hard to believe, 6 years ago, which led to the FDA approval of this treatment, was that in the period of observation, up to 30 months and beyond, as we'll talk about, patients who received tafamidis were more likely to be alive at the end of the study, to have a reduction in the risk of hospitalization for cardiovascular causes, and to have an improved quality of life and functional and less decline in functional capacity and quality of life during this period. So what about this functional capacity and quality of life? Shown here on the left is a 6-minute walk test, which has been established as the test by which we determine functional capacity. What's the distance you can walk over 6 minutes? And what you see here on this x-axis is time in months, and then the change from the baseline functional capacity when you began in the study towards the end of the study. And this Kaplan-Meier curves demonstrate that though there was a decline in both groups, the degree of decline for those individuals receiving tafamidis was less, and it was statistically different, highlighting the benefit of the drug. On the right, you see a measure of quality of life known as the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire. We have a member from the group and the team and the institution that developed this, Dr. Sperry. And what you see again is that the reduction over time in those individuals receiving tafamidis was less, and meaning they were able to relatively preserve their quality of life during the study period. Excuse me for that. Moving forward in the long-term extension, what was demonstrated that when we went beyond 30 months and we continued giving patients this treatment, and those patients who originally were randomized to placebo and then transitioned over to tafamidis, that the benefits extended even for longer periods of time. This means that in a median follow-up of 58 months, those patients who received tafamidis and then those patients who were transitioned over were more likely to survive. And this extrapolated placebo curve just means those patients who the curve would have theoretically continued if they had not transitioned over to tafamidis, again, highlighting the benefits of the drug. What about acoramidis, the second in class recently FDA-approved treatment for ATTR-CM, either wild type or variant disease? Well, this is a fascinating and exciting drug treatment, and highlights, I think, one of the major reasons I went into this space, because the ASG, the Amyloidosis Support Group, highlights the collaboration between patients, their families, industry, and clinicians. And there was, because of an incredible observation in patients who had a specific type of variant disease, a mutation in the gene at codon 50, a valine to methionine gene substitution, that there were a group of patients who were protected from the adverse events of that gene substitution. And it was a mutation in a different part of the gene that was found to be protective. And through synthetic generation of a compound that mimicked this ability to bind the TTR molecule or the protein and prevent the dissociation, this drug was developed. And what they did in this clinical trial, randomizing over 600 patients, was ask the question that if we looked at these following adverse events, death from any cause, cardiovascular-related hospitalization, a change in NT-proBNP, a biomarker that has been associated with disease progression and worsening prognosis in this disease, as well as the change in 6-minute walk over the period of the study in this hierarchical way, do patients who receive acoramidis do better than those patients that receive placebo, or was there no difference? And what they found using the statistical model known as win ratio, which again applied the statistical method known as the Finkelstein-Schoenfeld method, they found those patients randomized, and these patients received 800 milligrams of acoramidis twice a day, and 2 out of every 3 patients received the drug. Those patients who received the drug were more likely to benefit than those compared to placebo. So acoramidis was ultimately better. And then there were secondary endpoints shown here that I won't go through at the time because of the limitations on our time, that also showed benefits. And this highlights in the paper published also in New England Journal of Medicine by Dr. Gilmore and colleagues, that those patients with acoramidis were much more likely to have a success on this hierarchical endpoint than those patients who received placebo. Again, a wonderful development and now a new FDA-approved treatment for this disease. Shown here is more specific data regarding the NT-proBNP level. So on the left, I highlight in the x-axis the months. So the study ends at 30 months, and those patients who received acoramidis were less likely to have a worsening rise in their NT-proBNP at the end of the study relative to those patients who received placebo. And similar story to tafamidis, where patients received acoramidis were less likely to have worsening. Everyone, unfortunately, or most patients had a reduction in their functional capacity over time, but that reduction was less in individuals receiving acoramidis relative to placebo, again, in over 600 patients in the study. Important measures of quality of life, and then finally, TTR level are shown here. So the KCCQ score over time, again, reduction over time for both groups, but relative preservation for those individuals receiving the drug relative to placebo. And shown on the right is the association and the reality that if you received acoramidis, you had a healthier TTR protein, and the protein that was circulating your blood, the level goes up because there's no longer the dissociation, and this association of higher circulating TTR molecule with the outcome is very provocative, demonstrating the benefits of this drug in this therapy. Also similar to tafamidis, the investigators proceeded beyond 30 months because in the original trial, a survival benefit was not seen at 30 months because this group of patients studied in this trial were actually less sick than those in the original ATTR-ACT or tafamidis trial. And so they asked the question, let's go on further, extend the therapy in an open label extension, as is done in all of these phase 3 clinical trials. And beyond 30 months, what they found was actually a survival benefit. The patients who received acoramidis were more likely to survive up to 42 months in this first analysis published by Dan Judge and colleagues. And this is a preprint version now available in circulation online. And their quality of life was also preserved relative to those who did not receive the drug. Finally, let's talk about vutrisiran, and this drug therapy is not yet FDA approved, is currently under review by the FDA, and the promise is by the FDA that by March 23rd, we will have an answer as to whether this is a drug that we can use for patients with ATTR-CM. This subcutaneously delivered RNA interference therapeutic agent was used in a trial known as Helios-B that is now being evaluated for consideration for drug therapy. But at the time of the trial, as you'll learn from Dr. Karam, this drug has already been approved for the treatment of ATTR polyneuropathy in patients, again, with variant disease. And it is a subcutaneous drug delivered every 12 weeks, 25 milligrams. And so here is the trial and the results. This trial, randomizing again over 600 patients in a one-to-one fashion, shows the benefit as follows. So in the x-axis is time, and in the y-axis are the patients who, the percentage of which were free of an adverse event. And the primary endpoint was death from any cause and the risk of a cardiovascular adverse event, specifically the need for hospitalization for any cardiovascular event or urgent need for assessment and treatment for worsening heart failure. In over a 36-month follow-up period, patients receiving vutrisiran were less likely to have this adverse event. And it's important to note that this trial began and eventually was implemented at a time when tafamidis was available. So 40% of the patients in this trial were actually receiving combination treatment at the time of randomization with tafamidis and then either placebo or vutrisiran. And that means 60% of patients were on monotherapy, and meaning they did not receive tafamidis. And in that group, the benefits were also demonstrated. Here, again, the freedom from the combination of either dying from this disease and or having an adverse cardiovascular event during the study period. Now, death from any cause, when the double-blind period, meaning patients did not know and investigators obviously did not know of what drug therapy you received, when they extended the period of observation to 42 months, which again was very reasonable given the fact this group also is a healthier group relative to those patients enrolled in the original pivotal trial known as ATTR-ACT, which was the first FDA-approved treatment, obviously, for the drug, for the disease known as tafamidis. These patients actually eventually demonstrated a survival benefit, again, when the time of observation was extended, analogous to what was seen in acoramidis. So this is the first trial to demonstrate that in patients with ATTR-CM, that a RNA interference agent could improve the outcomes. What other outcomes? Well, first, let's highlight that knockdown or reduction in TTR was seen. So in blue, what you see here is by targeting the messenger RNA and knocking it down, you did not produce the protein. And this is relative to in magenta or maroon, those individuals who received placebo where their baseline TTR level was. Those randomized to vutrisiran had a marked reduction in serum transthyretin. Functional capacity benefits as well as quality of life benefits were also seen. Those patients randomized to vutrisiran were more likely to have relative preservation of their quality of life and less reduction in their 6-minute walk test. And there'll be more data coming out in regard to these outcomes in the next few months. But, this is all exciting news, but we're all here today, more than 300 people registered for this event because we still have persistent questions. And a recent, really wonderful review and I guess I'd say position paper by leaders in the field published in the European Heart Journal highlights the persistent questions that exist today. And for the second hour of our time, we will certainly be discussing it. One, what is the initial therapy that we should be applying for our patients? What's the best treatment? When should we switch one patient from one therapy to another? Are there times we need to stop a therapy? Do we know yet the financial burden of these treatments and potentially combination treatments? Should we be treating asymptomatic patients and should we be using combinations? And how do we justify and how do we interpret data when we do not have head-to-head clinical studies comparing and contrasting the outcomes for patients? And so in conclusion, disease-modifying treatments for ATTR-CM improve survival, morbidity, and quality of life for our patients. Treatment focused on the transthyretin stabilization, tafamidis and acoramidis specifically, and or the inhibition of TTR production by the use of an RNA interference therapeutic agent known as vutrisiran have now been shown to improve the outcomes for our patients. And I would conclude by saying that a personalized approach for comprehensive treatment is warranted. And I love this field, and I can't think of any disease that really highlights this very important point from a clinician that I certainly admired from the turn of the century of the 1900s, who shaped modern American medicine, Sir William Osler. A good clinician treats the disease, but a great clinician treats the patient who has the disease. And with that, I thank you for your time. It's a pleasure to get to be with you today, and I will stop sharing my slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheikh. Stay with us a minute. Bob, can you put up our ATTR treatment chart for a minute? I just want to, some questions have come up in regards to this, and I think with Dr. Sheikh's present, there you go. Okay, now, Dr. Sheikh mentioned the drug acoramidis. And if you look at the first column, the stabilizer column, you'll see that is now called Attruby under the commercial approved name, okay? And then we also mentioned tafamidis, which is Vyndaqel and Vyndamax. And and if you go over to the green column, okay, he talked about vutrisiran, which is now known as Amvuttra. So I know many people, and this is the discussion that's come up in our Facebook group as well, confusion with the names. So we want to make sure, and they'll probably there'll be more names coming, when they get approved maybe for another, for something else, maybe they'll even take on another name. So we just want to make sure everybody can see by looking at the chart that there are different names for these drugs, and we don't want it to be confusing. Okay, thank you so much. And that was a great presentation. You're right, there'll be lots of questions at the end of this.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and now we'll take Dr. Brett Sperry. So Dr. Sperry, your turn, take it away.
Can you guys see that? All right, thanks, Muriel, and thanks to the other organizers and to my colleagues here. I am a cardiologist at St. Luke's in Kansas City, and I'll be talking about some of the investigational treatments. I was asked to give a talk titled Curing ATTR-CM, I think at ASNC, the nuclear meeting, a few months ago. And I thought this title was apropos because I think people are asking, when can we get to a cure for this? And I want to start this off by saying, what is a cure? What is the definition of a cure? Several different definitions out there. The NIH Cancer Institute says to heal or restore health, a treatment to restore health. Cambridge Dictionary says something that makes someone who is sick healthy again. Merriam-Webster says recovery or relief from a disease. And Wikipedia says a substance or procedure that ends a medical condition. So maybe I fall more into the Wikipedia definition, where I think something that is ending a medical condition once and for all that you have is more in my mind what a cure is. And so have we reached a cure with the current generation of therapies for ATTR-CM, ATTR cardiac amyloidosis? This is a graph that I'm going to show you. This is how long people live in months, and on the x-axis is the number of months here. And this is what is expected for people who have this disease, who are in the clinical trials. And I'm going to show you the 3 clinical trials that we hear. You heard Dr. Sheikh talk a lot about this ATTR-ACT trial. This was showing that people live longer who are on tafamidis versus on placebo, but they're still well below what their age expected longevity is with this medication. Now, what we have to remember is this was studied now a long time ago. Over a decade ago, patients were enrolled into this study. So a lot has changed in the last decade. When you look at acoramidis in the ATTRibute study, people are living longer in both groups, the group who got the medication and who didn't get the medication. And that's a testament to diagnosing patients earlier, finding patients earlier, because this study was conducted more recently. And then finally, the most recent study is this Helios-B study, which we talked about. Again, both groups of patients are continue to do better, but we're still below this expected line for mortality. So I think we're getting closer to where we need to be, but we're not quite there yet. And just to highlight the 3 trials in the differences in disease severity, we could look on the bottom here where it says NAC stage. If you're stage 3, that's the highest severity of disease. And we had about 19–20% of people in stage 3 in tafamidis, and that went down to 11% and then down to 5.5% with vutrisiran. So in these trials, patients are getting healthier and healthier again, which is good. But still have significant symptoms. This is the quality of life that Dr. Sheikh was talking about. And this is pretty flat. You know, this is a pretty stable quality of life, which is good, but it's not an improvement in quality of life like what we would like when we're talking about getting towards something that we would consider a cure. So are we getting closer? Yes. Have we found a cure? No. And despite major improvements in how long people live, patients generally have stabilization as opposed to improvement of their markers of disease. Obviously, some patients will feel a lot better with treatment over time. Some people will not. But on average, there's stability as far as how patients feel. So let's get into some of the investigational treatments. And this is the next step to try to get even closer to a cure. There are many different algorithms to look at how these medications work and how this situation occurs with amyloidosis. It all starts in your DNA, and then that gets transcribed to messenger RNA and then translated into the protein. And so, as Dr. Sheikh was speaking about, we have the silencers that work up here and the stabilizers that work down there on the left. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but I'm assuming you can. So down there on the bottom left, that's where the protein gets stabilized. Well, we do have an investigational treatment that's even upstream from here. This is the CRISPR type gene editing, DNA editing type medication, where basically this is a one-time treatment that gets into the DNA and sort of snips out the area that makes the ultimately makes the TTR protein, and then links the two ends of the DNA of your genetic code back together. And this is, again, a one-time treatment. This is NTLA 2001. Now we're calling it NextZ. Muriel was talking about all the names that we have to learn. Well, this is a mouthful of a name when it's the whole name. So we're just going to call it NextZ because that's how they're abbreviating it. So here's the long name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but this was just published in New England Journal of Medicine a couple months ago. Phase 1 early phase study of 36 patients with hereditary ATTR who received this medication. And they had about a 90% reduction in their serum TTR levels after a year. And the adverse events were only related to the actual infusion, and they were transient and short-lived. So that's exciting. There's a phase 3 study that's ongoing right now that we're in, and Dr. Sheikh is in at his center, as well as many others. This is called the Magnitude study. Again, single one-time treatment. This is for patients with hereditary or wild type ATTR, and there's several inclusion criteria there to potentially qualify for that study. So the ChatGPT answer, probably, which is the best answer for a cure here, is to cure ATTR, transthyretin cardiac amyloidosis, would mean to develop a treatment that can fully stop and reverse the disease process. So that's where we're going with the next set of medications. This is the reversing of the disease process. We think that the silencers and the stabilizers and the gene therapy, they prevent the protein from breaking down further and getting into the heart any further. And the hope is that with time, your own body can help to clear out some of the amyloid plaques in the heart. That's not been borne out yet in large numbers or in large trials. And if that does happen, it probably takes a very, very, very long time for that to happen. So is there some way to speed up the process where we can give some sort of medication that targets the heart for the immune system to clear the amyloid fibrils out of the heart? And there are 3 medications here that are currently being studied. One we call AT02, one is ALXN2220, and one is NNC6019. So a lot of letters and numbers here, but we'll talk about what they do. So the first one is the AT02 medication, and this is derived from this AT01 imaging agent that some of you may have participated in this trial, gone down to see Dr. Wall in Tennessee. he has this peptide, which he calls P5+14, which can target amyloid, any type of amyloid anywhere in the body. And then if he links an imaging tracer to that peptide, you can do a scan, one of these PET scans that you see on the right here, and it lights up the areas with amyloid. And you see on the top right, this is a PYP scan. This is a really borderline scan result. You see a little bit of uptake around the heart, but not much. But the same patient gets his scan, which he calls I-124 evuzametide, and very clearly you see the circle, the orange, yellow-orange of the heart there, this horseshoe shape of the heart. And so that's a positive study. So he's tagged this peptide to an imaging agent. And actually, that is going to be in clinical trials, and it's just started this week. The first patient was randomized in this trial just this past week, and it's called the REVEAL trial. And this is not for people who already have amyloidosis. Just to clarify, this trial, this is an imaging trial for people where you're not sure if they have amyloidosis. And then you can do this scan to see, do they have AL or ATTR or some other type of amyloid. So this is the AT01. It's this P5+14 tagged to an imaging agent. Now we have P5+14 tagged to an antibody, a monoclonal antibody, and this is the AT02. This is the medication that's in a phase 1 trial and hopefully will be in a broader phase 3 trial later this year. This harnesses your own immune system and targets your immune system at the amyloid fibrils in your body to try to remove them. That's the goal. You know, these are still studies, so we don't know how well they're going to work yet, right? Or if there are going to be any toxicities. These are still investigational, but this is the theory behind it and why people are excited about this type of medication. So then the second one that's the furthest along, this one's the furthest along of the depleter medications. This is the ALXN2220. Previously, this was called NI006. Similar concept. This is an antibody. It binds to a different part of the amyloid fibril in misfolded or aggregated TTR. There was a phase 1 early phase study there which showed improvements in imaging and in some markers of severity of heart disease with labs. So on the top right, you see this scan here where you see the clear black outline of the heart there. And then after 4 months of treatment, it's less, and then it's even less after 12 months of treatment. So this is this nuclear scan improving. On the bottom right, you have a cardiac MRI, which also is improving. We look at something called extracellular volume, and it's 60%, and then it goes to 48, and it goes to 42. So that's signs of improvement of amyloid burden in the heart. Phase 3 study currently ongoing. This is an infusion. All 3 of these medications are infusion. So this is an every 4-week infusion. The infusion takes about an hour and a half to do. And then people are there in the infusion center for maybe an hour before and after just to make sure everything's okay. 1,000 subjects, 2-to-1 randomization. So for every 3 people, 2 will get the actual medication and 1 will get placebo. And these are now randomized trials to see if they work. So we're all blinded. The investigators like me are blinded. We don't know who's getting what, and we just wait till the end of the trial and see how people do. The third one, very same concept, NNC6019, previously called PRX004, also an antibody. Here's a nice image of, on the left, you see a TTR amyloid fibril here, and then an immune cell. And then on the right, you see that immune cell has gobbled up the fibril, puts it into the immune cell, and then the cell breaks it down into its individual components and eliminates it. So this is the hope, obviously, of what is going to take place in people's hearts. This is also a similar phase 3 trial, every 4-week infusion. What about natural reversal? This was published a couple years ago in New England Journal in the center in the UK. They found 3 of their patients with ATTR-CM had a random and complete or near complete reversal of their heart disease without any treatment at all. And so how did that happen? No one knows, but we have on the right, we have some images of it. We have a thick heart on the top that gets thinner. And the second image is a cardiac MRI. The white in the heart is a surrogate for amyloid fibrils, which goes way down in the second image on the right from the top. ECV improves, and then the nuclear scintigraphy improves. So they did biopsies on these people's hearts, and they found a lot of immune activation in the heart that was clearing these amyloid fibrils. And they did antibody blood testing, and they found that these people had antibodies that were attacking the TTR protein, the deposits in the heart. And why they had this, no one knows, but maybe what they found here will end up in some sort of treatment in the future. Maybe it'll end up in a vaccine. You know, maybe when we're all 60 years old, we get our ATTR vaccines, you know, to train our body to attack amyloid fibrils in the future. A lot to come in the future here. What about prevention? Dr. Sheikh talked about the acoramidis medication for treatment of people who have ATTR-CM. What about people who have the gene and they're predisposed, but they don't yet have cardiac disease or neuropathy? This is a growing number of patients that we have now because we're diagnosing patients with the variant or hereditary form, and then their children or their brothers or sisters are getting genetic testing, and then we screen those patients to see if they have cardiac disease, and maybe they don't, but they want to do something. They want to do something to prevent getting cardiac disease or prevent what their family members have had. So there's this study that we call ACT Early, and it's for patients just with this exact scenario who have the gene but don't yet have cardiac or nerve disease, and they have the ability to get in this study and get acoramidis versus placebo, and we're going to try to find out if this medication prevents disease going forward. So this is the landscape of different trials: gene silencing, fibril depletion, and prevention. Just an overview of basically what I spoke about. So really, really exciting times, obviously. We hope as investigators, we hope that all these medications work, all these trials work, and we can have many new medications for patients to get closer and closer to cure this disease. And I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Muriel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sperry. And I do want to say that when we will be putting, you know, the recording up, and hopefully our physicians will say that we can put up the recordings with their presentations fully. So we get a nod there, and I'm sure Dr.
Sounds good.
Sheikh is nodding as well. Okay, so next we will hear from our neuropathy expert. Okay, Dr. Chafic Karam, and he's a familiar face to a lot of you, I know, and he's wonderful. And whenever we ask if he will appear, he says yes. And so he's special. Thank you, Dr. Karam. Take it away.
Thank you, Muriel, for having me. So we're going to be talking about the neuropathy treatment. And, you know, it's important to note that all of these treatments work on amyloid. I mean, amyloid is widespread in the body, and these drugs will work on the nerve, on the heart. But the way the drug was studied led to approval by the FDA to cardiac targeted or neuropathy targeted. That does not mean that it's not going to work on both. And that's an important thing to remember. These are my disclosures. We already had an outline of this disease, but basically the transthyretin is mainly made by the liver, but other organs also make it. And that's important to remember. You know, the brain makes it, the eyes make it, and some of you may have problem with the eyes or the brain. And this protein, when it's made by the liver, it does have a useful function. So it's a normal protein to be in the body, and we can test it. So it is still called prealbumin in the blood test in the laboratory, and it's easily available. We check it a lot. Now, obviously, the stabilizer going to increase the concentration of this protein, and the silencer are going to decrease the concentration of the protein. So depending on what drug you're taking, the TTR can increase or go up. And what happens with this protein, if you have the genetic variant, or if you're predisposed, especially if you're getting older, it may kind of misfold and start causing trouble. And we call it amyloid when it causes trouble. And it's important also to note that there's many different causes of amyloid. There's actually over 40 described amyloid protein in nature. But the most common are TTR and AL, and it's very important to differentiate the two because the treatment is completely different, obviously. And some people may have the variant, but they also may have AL, so you have to check for those. When we talk about the management of the neuropathy, there's obviously targeting the ATTR, which this is what I'll be talking about today. But it's also extremely important to target the symptoms because this can significantly help with quality of life. We've talked about those in the past, and obviously we probably will talk a lot about those in the Q&A. So you've heard from my colleagues in cardiology. They did an excellent job at presenting the different medication for TTR. We have the silencers, which go to the liver and tell the liver to stop making the TTR protein. And you can see it actually, if you test your TTR levels or the prealbumin, it's going to drop when you start these medications. So it's a proof that the drug is working. Or you can do the stabilizer, which stabilizes the protein and make sure it does not misfold and start causing problem. And obviously, we saw with Dr. Sperry the research being done at what we call depleters. So you have these three terms that we use. We have the silencers, we have the stabilizers, and now we have the depleters. This is kind of the same thing. What is approved today by the FDA for polyneuropathy are three drugs. You have patisiran and vutrisiran, and the commercial name of patisiran is Onpattro, and the commercial name of vutrisiran is Amvuttra. Both of these are RNA interfering drug. And then you have eplontersen, which is antisense oligonucleotide. Commercial name is called Wainua. And all of these are going to target the liver. So they're going to go directly to the liver and tell the liver to stop making this protein. And then we have the other drugs that you've also heard about, tafamidis, diflunisal, and acoramidis. These are not approved by the FDA for polyneuropathy, but they are, as I mentioned when I started this talk, is that all of these drugs are going to target the TTR. So whether you have the neuropathy or the cardiomyopathy, all of these 6 ones that are listed here will help with these conditions. And then we have the potential future drugs. So talking about the neuropathy, I'm going to show you data of the proof that proves that these drugs work, and they work actually very well. But how do we measure it? It's important just to show how we measure it. We do the neuropathy impairment scale, we do nerve conduction study, quantitative sensory testing, autonomic testing, and we come up with a score. We call it the NIS, and the 0 is normal, and as it goes up, it becomes worse and worse. So you want it to be stabilized and not go up. So this is one of the measure. The second measure is a quality of life. So it's a questionnaire that we borrowed from studies on diabetic neuropathy, but we also applied on the amyloid disease, and we also have the staging of the neuropathy. So for the NIS, when we test the strengths, if you're very strong, we call it normal. We give you a score of 0. If the reflexes are normal, we give 0. If the sensation is normal, we also call it 0. And then if you're a little bit weak or your sensation is decreased, we start adding numbers, and it goes up as things get worse. And this is for the quality of life. Kind of same thing. If you have no problem, no symptoms, from pain or dysautonomia or function of your daily living, you'll have zeros everywhere. And if things are impaired, we'll start adding numbers as well. So the OG, the original drugs that were studied for the neuropathy, we had two back in 2018, published and approved actually, patisiran in inotersen. Inotersen is no longer available right now, but we had a lot of patients who were on it as well. Patisiran is the Onpattro. It's an infusion. Both of these drugs, they do kind of the same thing. They suppress the production of the TTR protein, and you can see it here. It drops dramatically between 70 to 80% of your baseline TTR protein. This is how much it's reduced. And this causes an improvement or stabilization, at least, in the neuropathy symptoms. So you have the NIS, which I just mentioned, meaning the strengths, the sensation, the reflexes, your nerve conduction study, etc. In the patisiran study here, you can see how, sorry, my mouse for some reason is not working. You can see how in the bottom blue line, it's stable or improving even, which is something we've never seen in this disease. Whereas, unfortunately, people on placebo continue to progress rapidly. And remember that, look at this, in 9 months, they worsened about 10 points to 15 points, actually. And in 18 months, about 28 points. And I'll show you why this is important, because now we have data up to 5 years, and you'll see the difference between the two. And quality of life also improved or remained stable in people with taking the patisiran. Kind of similar things happen with inotersen as well. And overall, the patisiran was safe. Inotersen had some black box warning regarding the blood count, especially the platelet, which could be suppressed and cause a bleeding problem. We also had to monitor the kidney, etc. So that's probably why we don't use it anymore, and the company has decided to take it off the market. We have the better version, which is eplontersen. I'm going to talk about this later. So what about long-term data? And here at the ASG, the Amyloid Support Group, we promise we always bring you the latest research that's available. And you can see this paper was just published a few days ago, January 13, 2025. And you can see that the study on patisiran, up to 5 years, the suppression of the TTR protein continues to happen the same way. And this is important because you can imagine that the drug may lose potency or efficacy, or maybe people can make antibodies and start rejecting the drug, but we're not seeing really that. This is 5 years of data, and we've followed patients for even longer who were on trials, and they're really doing very well. So these drugs continue to work even after many, many years. And you can see here also in the neuropathy impairment score compared to placebo and in the quality of life that things also are relatively stable. I mean, very small progression. Remember, I told you, look at this 15 at 9 months and 24 at 18 months worsening in an NIS. And you look here, after 5 years, you barely have a few points of worsening. So there's a slight decline, but really nothing compared to what happened in people who are not on any treatment. Now, one thing important to note on this, you can see that people who were initially started on placebo and then switched to the open label, so meaning that they started the patisiran later or the treatment later, 18 months later, they also stabilized, but what they have lost, unfortunately, did not come back, right? So they were not able to join the patient who were initially in the patisiran arm. And this is why we're always obsessing over diagnosing people early and starting treatment early. So I know a lot of patients, I was like asking, well, what drug should I take? What should I do, et cetera, et cetera. I tell people, what's really important is to start as soon as possible the treatment. So that's what's really relevant and what is translated in these studies here. Same thing for the survival probability. Now, this has, if you look carefully at the data, some people didn't die from, the amyloid. There are other reasons why people died. But again, people who are on the drug that initially would do better than people who were not treated for many, many months or even years. Now, more recently, we have the silencer version 2. So the patisiran we had a upgraded version of it called vutrisiran, And then with the inotersen, we have the eplontersen or Wainua. These drugs were compared, kind of do this exactly the same thing. Again, they suppress the TTR level. You can see here, vutrisiran suppress it significantly, like 80% plus. And kind of similar thing with eplontersen. And the bottom one, you see how it suppresses over time the TTR to reach 80% as well. And when you compare to historical placebo, because obviously when we have these drugs, we already have treatment, so we're not going to do studies with patients not on any drug. So we did them and compared them to what historically has been shown, meaning that in the original patisiran and inotersen trial. And again, you can see similar efficacy. So these drugs are very similar to what we saw with patisiran and inotersen. So, and they're safer actually. One thing to note, why do they decide to do one versus the other? Really, we don't have a comparison, right, between these drugs. So we don't really know which one is better. They seem to be, and it's very hard to compare one trial to another. But overall, they're both positive trial. They're both working very well. And really, the main difference is that with the vutrisiran or Amvuttra, it is administered under the skin once every 3 months by a healthcare provider. So once every 3 months by a healthcare provider under the skin. It's a subcutaneous injection. Whereas Wainua or eplontersen is administered once a month. So you do it once a month by the patient, or so that's the difference. Really, I think mainly between the way it is administered. That's what I explain to patients and tell them to decide what they want depending on their lifestyle, what they prefer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, we have other drugs that some of you may still be using. Diflunisal, it's an anti-inflammatory drug that works very well on the neuropathy as well. And tafamidis, by the way, was studied over 15 years ago for neuropathy and was found to be positive. It was just not approved by the FDA, but it has been used in Europe for 15 years for the neuropathy as well. So people still use it in Europe for the stage 1, but as they progress, they switch them to the silencer. So that may give you an idea that why they do it, mainly probably from economical issues in Europe. So, and then finally, a lot of patients in the United States end up on combination therapy because the cardiologist prescribe the tafamidis or the Vindamax, and then the neurologist would prescribe the Amvuttra or Wainua. And then what ends up happening is that some people may be on both. And the question, is this better than being on one or the other? And this is a question. This is an answer that we don't really have a question to. Dr. Sheikh mentioned that in the Amvuttra trial or vutrisiran, there were a lot of people who were on both as well. We looked retrospectively at our patient population, and we found that about a third were actually on combination therapy. And we didn't really find a lot of difference between people who were on combination versus people who were on monotherapy, by the way. There was this. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. And we'll take some question, or we'll switch to, I don't know, I'll let Muriel decide what we're going to do next.
Thank you, Dr. Karam. I just want to say one thing. You were about to say something, and then you stopped yourself. When you were talking about combination therapy, you were about to...
because my frontal lobe is still working. So I'm going to stop.
You were about to say were you about to say there was a slight improvement on both? Were you about to say something like...
No, I wasn't going to say anything. I will stop here.
Okay.
Nobody can put words in my mouth. Don't put words in my mouth, Muriel. We're stopping here.
What? Okay. Now...
Ask Farooq and Brett that question. Let them answer that question.
That question
the
will be
cardiologist.
asked. You can count on it. But first, we're going to hear from Paula for a few minutes on financial aid, and Paula, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to be talking today basically about patient support, genetic testing, and financial assistance. Next slide, please. And this is the link that is no longer correct. Thank you again, Dr. Sperry, for letting me know that. These other assistance programs, they are in the chat, but every pharmaceutical company has people that are there for you to contact to either get assistance, or if you have some questions, they may be able to answer them for you, or if you're having problems getting your drug set up, contact these folks. That is what they are there for. They have patient advocates that are there to help you. But like I said, every website, every pharmaceutical company has those. And some of them will offer financial assistance if you are low income. Generally, it's 350% of the federal poverty rate or lower. They can explain that to you, but know that if you are low income, that you may be able to get free drugs delivered to you from the pharmaceutical company. So don't give up and say, oh, well, I just can't take any medicine because I can't afford it. There is assistance out there, and that's what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. There are foundations for those that do qualify through their insurance company. The drug is covered, and if the drug is covered, you're going to have a large copay. These financial foundations are out there, and they can help you with the portions of the premium that you can't afford. Healthwell Foundation is one of the excellent ones, and right now they are the only one of these funds that I have listed that are currently open to accepting new patients. The Cardiomyopathy Fund pays up to $10,000 a year, but you must be Medicare. You must be on Medicare to qualify for this, and you can make up to 500% of the federal poverty guidelines to get assistance through them. They also have a separate amyloidosis fund that is open as well, which pays up to $8,000 a year. But for those of you that aren't old enough yet for Medicare, this is the one you'd be able to get. They do not require Medicare for that. But currently, if you are on a Truby, the only one of these two funds that covers a Truby is the Cardiomyopathy Fund. So just keep that in mind. NORD this past year added amyloidosis to their copay assistance funds, and they are waitlisted at the moment. You can go ahead and contact them, go through the website and get on the wait list. You always want to get on any of the wait lists for these, because once the funds come back in and they're able to reopen the particular disease fund, they will contact you and let you know you can go ahead and apply now. But that fund, you have to be at or below around 400% poverty level. Now, I was told by them that they have a little bit of leeway with that. All of the organizations go by the same chart with the federal poverty guidelines. But if you live in, say, New York City or LA, somewhere that has a higher cost of living, there is an adjustment that they can make. So you can make perhaps a bit over 400% of the poverty level and still qualify. So going by the chart that you'll see in a minute, that chart is a guideline. It's not necessarily what they go by 100% of the time. So if you're close to the cutoff threshold for your household size, be sure to contact the individual charity and see if they have an allowance for where you live. Next slide, please. The Patient Access Network, which is the Penn Foundation, they offer $2,000 a year. You have to be on Medicare only again, but it's at or below 500% of the poverty level. Again, they have a wait list. Please sign up for it. Patient Advocate Foundation pays up to $3,000 a year. They will accept people that are on Medicare, Medicaid, or military. The Assistance Fund, again, that one's closed right now, and you must reapply for that each calendar year. these funds do open up several times throughout the year. So don't go in there today and say, oh gosh, it's closed. I can't get any assistance for the year. You need to check back and see if it has opened up. Next slide, please. Okay. The federal poverty guidelines just came out this past Wednesday for 2025. This chart has the new thresholds that you are allowed to make. This is, I believe they go by your adjusted gross income. So, you know, if you're a family, you can look at the chart here on the left-hand side. If you're a family of one, or just, you know, just you, family of two, most of these pay 500%, or you have to make below 500% of the poverty rate. You would go over to the 500% category, and you can now make $105,750 and qualify for assistance from the organizations that want you to be below 500%. There are separate columns for Alaska and Hawaii because the cost of living is greater in both of those states. So they, if you live in either one of those locations, go by those columns. Next slide. Okay, this is the slide I was looking for. The Fund Finder app. When I said to sign up for all the wait lists, if you only want to sign up for one wait list, you can go to this website, fundfinder.pennfoundation.org, and you will be able to enter in that you want to know about the amyloidosis funds, and they will email you when a fund opens. If you can see here on this chart, you've got these padlocks. The red ones at that time were closed. If a fund is open, it will have the green lock that is unlocked. That one just happens to be Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which does not apply to you, but this is an old slide. But that just shows you the difference in what you will see on that chart. But you will receive an email from the Fund Finder app that says HealthWell has opened up their fund. So you know that you can go to HealthWell then and apply. This does tend to lag a little bit, so I like to sign up for all of them, plus this one. So I'm guaranteed to get an email from somebody that says this fund is opened. Because sometimes when this opens, it may only be open 24, 48 hours before the funds are depleted again. So you have to act fast. Keep your tax forms for this past year, get them, dig them out, keep them where you can get to them readily. So if you get an email that says, hey, this is open, you can call them up then. You'll have your paperwork where you need it and be able to get to it quickly. So that will help you possibly be one of those in line that gets those funds when they come out. But just know that there is help out there. Be persistent in looking for it. You know, like I said, if it is closed at one point, it may reopen later in the year. One thing I did not think about earlier on the HealthWell Foundation, the Cardiomyopathy Fund offers $10,000 a year. Well, now we all have a $2,000 out-of-pocket max for those of us on Medicare. You think, well, I only need $2,000. What am I going to do with that other $8,000? They will allow you to change your criteria for what you want to get from them. You can switch from having them cover your drugs to having them pay for your Medicare Part B premiums. You can make that change once per year. So if you get a grant from them and you haven't met your out-of-pocket yet for the year, go ahead and apply for that grant and tell them you want to cover your medicines for right now. 1 month or 2 refills, and you'll have your $2,000 met probably for sure. And then you can switch it over and have them pay your Medicare premiums for the rest of the year. So you can use up that money that's now left over because your out-of-pocket has been met. So just keep that in mind. And I do believe that's my last slide. So thank you very much, and get out there and apply for those funds.
Thank you so much, Paula. You're everybody's best friend today, I know. And if anyone has any questions Paula's email is paula@amyloidosissupport.org. We made it very simple for you. Okay, thank you again. Now, if we can have all of our amyloidologists with their video on, and we'll be asking questions, okay? And for Eugene, Tom, Roberta, Christopher, Jim, Ray, and many, many others who sent in this request, Vindamax, Vindical, or tafamidis versus acoramidis, also known as Attruby. Which is better? Which should I use? Help me, doctors. Okay, now we know there's been no head-to-head trials. There probably never will be. So we will just get Dr. Sheikh, you're first on my screen here, so let's go to you first.
Daunting first question.
Good
but
choice. Good choice of someone to answer this first. I'm going to pass to my colleagues.
I could have predicted we would have started with one of these questions. Very important question, causes everybody a lot of angst. The bottom line is we do not have definitive data. And I think, Muriel, you said it. I can't think of a scenario by which we will. But what are the bright points, and what are the things that we can learn from the trials that should give us hope and guidance that, irrespective of the decision, which drug you're on, which, by the way, based on the presentation Paula gave and the comments that were made regarding Dr. Sperry's update regarding some programs that are not being funded at the current time, it's probably, we might feel like your clinicians and you together will make the decision, but we must remember that insurance and potentially other regulatory bodies will make these decisions. So we may not exactly have a say as to whether you get acoramidis or tafamidis as the year develops. So much more to follow on this. We won't solve that today. Sitting here today, what I would say is I'm not able to answer the question if one, quote unquote, is better than the other, but the synergy and the consistency by which the following happens, that these drugs mechanistically do what they are asked to do, which is to stabilize the protein. Then in concert with that, there are, for those patients who receive the drug, there are less reduction in the individual's quality of life and their functional capacity. Finally, with now data in both drug therapies through the longer term open label extension that the trials support, there is survival benefit for both the drugs. To me, the question isn't necessarily currently what drug we use, but can we use it earlier in the disease state? Because clearly the benefits have been shown that if we do that. I would tell you, Dr. Moore and the team at Columbia has published their data internally at Columbia regarding earlier treatment, earlier disease recognition, better outcomes in three sort of eras of their program, an earlier era, a middle era, and a more recent one, which really to me is a take-home message. We should be on the therapy. I think the second part, which I know will be another topic, is really the question I would be asking, which is, I get on one of these therapies, but is the drug working? Is there disease progression? That's why I wrote in my concluding slide at the bottom where a personalized approach has to be applied. Every patient will, like any other disease, respond differently to the treatment depending on where they are identified by having the disease, what stage of the disease they're in, and then how their body receives that therapy. So I gave you a long-winded answer. I didn't answer the question. Please forgive me because I don't know the answer, but I think both drugs are beneficial. I think the data supports use of either, and the key is to monitor the response to the treatment.
I feel like, I'm on CNN or Fox News and I just a politician or something.
Sorry.
Okay, Dr. Ruberg. Okay, Dr. Ruberg, I was diagnosed with ATTR wild type today, which I wasn't, but we're just going to say I was. And I go to you, okay, because I have family in Boston. Okay, so I'm going to go to you, and I go to you. Which drug are you going to put me on, tafamidis or Attruby?
Well, not going to give as kind of as an eloquent an answer as Farooq just did. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for letting me crash the party late. You're not going to be able to pin any of us down with an answer. I'm going to tell you right now. I think it really depends, it's going to come down to cost and patient preference. And so that's kind of really, and as Farooq said pretty clearly, it's going to depend on what the copay is. I mean, I sometimes ask patients, do you want to take a twice day or once daily drug? I mean, but for most people, that really doesn't make a difference. So I'm going to basically kind of take the same sort of, cop out that Farooq did, but it's not really a cop out. Both drugs you can consider are probably going to be equally effective. I mean, we don't have any data to suggest that, but I think either are reasonable as first-line therapy. The more challenging question that you have not asked, which is not a question that you can ask now, is what happens when and likely if vutrisiran is approved for amyloid cardiomyopathy. Then we have two different classes of medications, and then we have to ask the question, which of those do we choose? Or do we actually prescribe people two medications at tremendous cost? So those are, I think, some of the more challenging questions, which are not things we can ask right now, but probably later this year, you have us all back, then you can pin us down with a more challenging question. For now, whether it's tafamidis or acoramidis, it doesn't really matter. You pick whatever is most cost effective to you as a patient.
Okay,
I
Dr.
would add,
Okay.
Muriel, I just want to make one comment because Rick's response jogged sort of my initial memory. It causes angst for patients, but it really shouldn't, because think about the treatment of hypertension or diabetes, and there are drugs and classes that both have benefit. They've been studied rigorously, and we don't necessarily get the choice sometimes if we're going to get one flavor of an SGLT2 inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker, but the drugs work. We're not having those types of conversations, right? So I recognize there's some angst, but the data is clear. They both work, and they prove all the metrics that we just discussed. And it's very much analogous to the treatment of other chronic diseases.
Okay, Dr. Sperry, we'll try one more time. I'm independently wealthy and write checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars every day and don't care about money. And I went to see you for my diagnosis of ATTR-CM. Which one are you going to start me on?
Well, first, just want to clarify something that Paula said about the alnylamab before I get into this. But the alnylamab still is available. They just switched the companies, so they went from Invitae to Prevention, and then there's another one called Navigator that's also through Prevention. So there's genetic testing through Prevention Genetics with both of them. Which one to start is a hard question to answer, and I think there's pros and cons to both, and maybe we can mention some of and this is why there's a controversy, right? Because what stabilizes the protein more, and that's controversial. The people who developed tafamidis say that they're about the same, in their lab. And then the people that developed acoramidis say that acoramidis is a better stabilizer in their lab. There's a third-party lab that Dan Judge was involved in, I think, and he's not here, but that lab found that the acoramidis was a stronger stabilizer of the protein, right? So that kind of has us in the acoramidis column, right? But in the tafamidis column, when you look at the trials, actually, the only trial that showed that the single endpoint of living longer won with the drug was tafamidis. Okay, so acoramidis in a composite endpoint with how long you lived and what was how much frequently you were hospitalized and all this stuff was better with acoramidis, obviously, but tafamidis won on the mortality endpoint. Now, there's reason for that. It's because when tafamidis was around, there was nothing else around, and we were diagnosing really sick patients, and I showed that slide earlier. But if you're a purist to the data, it would make you put a check mark in the tafamidis column for that. Okay, then how frequently do you take the medications? Well, Vindamax is once a day, one pill once a day. Attruby is 2 pills twice a day, so it's 4 pills versus 1 pill. But then the other curveball that's getting thrown in this year apparently is a lot of these Medicare Part D programs are not allowing you to do Vindamax and making you do Vindaquel, which is 4 pills also. So now we're 4 pills with for some people. So that's balancing itself out as a wash there a little bit. You know, the thing that I was going to say that Farooq also just commented on in the hypertension world is, just to piggyback off what he said, is like if you have high blood pressure and you want to get started on a high blood pressure medication, right? You can start an ARB, an angiotensin receptor blocker, and there's like 10 or 20 of them that you could start there, and they all lower your blood pressure. And at the same in heart failure, you can start low sartan. People have probably heard of low sartan, right? Candesartan, valsartan, something with the sartan at the end. Well, valsartan and candesartan, they block the protein much more strongly than block the receptor much more strongly than losartan does. But we still very frequently pick losartan because because of different reasons, you know. Ultimately, when the trials have been done, all of these medications have shown benefit, but we're not picking like one ARB, one sartan medicine over the other one because of something that's happening in test tubes. You know, we're picking it based upon the trial data that's out there that's showing benefit in the outcomes that people have. So, you know, another long-winded answer here. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think all of us will probably pick a little bit of both and pick some that, you know, if insurance is, I've already had insurance, you know, telling me to go one way or the other with these. So I foresee that continuing to happen. I think as Dr. Ruberg was saying, you know, later this year, we may have another option with the vutrisiran, and that's a, you know, a healthcare provider administered injection that's like 4 times a year. And so that's another thing that people may prefer that, or they may not prefer that depending upon where they live. And we don't have head-to-head data for all these. It's really hard to say.
Thank you. Dr. Karam, Joan says she has wild-type TTR with cardiac symptoms and peripheral neuropathy. And we do hear more and more wild-type people talking about neuropathy these days. If I'm able to take Amvuttra when it is approved, can I expect any improvement in the peripheral neuropathy, or will it just stop or slow it from progressing? And you just mentioned a few minutes ago that as far as you're concerned, all these drugs that work on the TTR made by the liver will help either neuropathy or cardiomyopathy. And obviously that's obvious. I mean, but for helping Joan, will it stop it or slow it from progressing, the neuropathy, do you think?
Right. So that's a great question, Joan. Thank you. It's very important first to, and I've said that many times, so people who have heard me talk before, they know that, is that first of all, we have to make sure that what the patient is suffering from is actually neuropathy, right? Not something that can sound like neuropathy, like spinal stenosis or arthritis, etc. So that's number one. Because the other ones will not respond to treatment, to TTR treatment. Number two, what we have to note is that there are hundreds of reasons why people get peripheral neuropathy. And wild-type TTR happens as we get older. And the reasons why, or the risk factors to develop neuropathy become much more frequent as we get older. So it's very important to know why the patient has neuropathy. So do we really think it's from the wild-type TTR amyloid, or is it from something else? Because obviously, if it's from something else, you know, Amvuttra, Wainua, all of these are not going to do anything. And then third, you know, a lot of these drugs, what have they been shown, and I think we've repeated this both on the cardiac and the neuropathy aspect, is that what they do, they slow down the progression of the disease. So the damage that has already happened, unfortunately, may not necessarily reverse. Now, with the hereditary, we have seen some people get better a little bit, but that's not what we expect. Most people just stabilize or slow the progression. And then finally, you know, once there's nerve damage, a lot of time the nerve will get irritated, and the treatment, and I said that, and it's not only the TTR treatment, but the symptoms. So whenever we're treating neuropathy, we're treating the cause of the neuropathy, but we're also treating the the neuropathy symptoms. So the pain, the numbness, the tingling, etc. We have medication that we use in combination with the TTR targeted therapy. So it's a long answer because it's not as, it may sound like a simple question, but unfortunately, there's a lot of variables that come in play.
Okay. Now we'll go on to some questions about the Watchman. Okay. Leah, what concerns or risks for cardiac amyloidosis patients are there for a Watchman implant? First of all, I need education on what a Watchman is. So whichever one of you cardiologists wishes to start with this and give us a little overview of Watchman, that would be great. Any hands? Okay, Dr. Sheikh. You're on mute.
My apologies. The Watchman device is one in a class of device therapies, which perform the following goal and function, which is to occlude the left atrial appendage. So the left atrium, the upper chamber on the left side of the heart, is associated in patients with atrial fibrillation as a source of development of blood clots, which tragically can cause strokes, where there's an embolic event where that area, that left atrial appendage, can form a clot and then be propagated to the body. And there have been studies in obviously human beings that demonstrate that this treatment can reduce the risk of stroke, particularly favorably in individuals who do not tolerate anticoagulation. By that I mean, unfortunately, blood thinners are not received by all of us equally, and so some can have complications, major bleeding, etc. And so this therapy is beneficial in this regard. Now, we recognize all of us are constantly very much looking out and surveilling for the risk of stroke in our amyloidosis patients, because depending on the type of amyloid you have and other clinical features, your risk of stroke can be quite high. And some of the traditional ways in which we measure risk do not apply to patients with amyloidosis because that risk is higher. So not surprisingly, particularly remember in these clinical trials, our average patient population in clinical trials is 75, 77, an older population where the risk of bleeding is not trivial. People are now considering these therapies. To my knowledge, there has certainly not been a randomized study to compare amyloid patients who receive the device and then are getting traditional versus getting traditional therapy for anticoagulation to see whether they're beneficial, or for people who do not tolerate blood thinners, just randomizing patients or randomly assigning patients the Watchman device. This is one of a class of group of left atrial appendage occluders, or LAAO. So I will tell you, I do have a few patients who have received it. Entirely that population were patients, it's kind of actually something, you're jogging my memory here, whereas I'm thinking we probably should write our case series. Actually, the time of left atrial appendage occlusion was the time when people started thinking about amyloid and called our local center of excellence for, do you think this patient has amyloid? So they already got their Watchman device, and then we were on the back end saying, okay, yes, this does look like ATTR disease, or actually in one case, AL disease. And so we don't have definitive data. I think this is where shared decision-making matters. And I know I do sound very political today. I'm sorry, not intentional. But I have, there are patients I take care of that they just cannot tolerate anticoagulation. They've had bleeding in the gut. They've had, there are risks for fall. And we have together in shared decision-making, knowing the gaps in knowledge, offered the therapy. And thus far, it has been successful. Again, anecdotal data is not what any of us seek, but the reality, that's what we have. And there may be a role for certain patients. I do foresee over the next few years a more comprehensive sort of plan for how we take care of atrial fibrillation in amyloid patients will be considered. And so some of these studies might get done.
Okay. Dr. Ruberg?
Just a couple of additional thoughts to Dr. Sheikh's great summary. So totally agree, there are no informative data. I will tell you that Martha Grogan at Mayo Clinic has attempted to pool data, and we contributed some. Again, like Farooq, just a few patients at our center who have the device. Those data, I have not seen the kind of the analysis that came out of them. So I really don't know. A couple thoughts about Watchman. Number one, first of all, there are risks to putting the procedure to the procedure itself, and that's something that needs to be considered. mean, apixaban or Eliquis, which is what most patients take for anticoagulation these days, or rivaroxaban, Xarelto, the bleeding risk is incredibly low. It's slightly more than if you took aspirin. It's definitely more, but not that much more. So much safer than Coumadin, for example, or warfarin for bleeding. So you're going against a relatively very safe drug in the first place. But just like Dr. Sheikh said, there are some people who have like bleeding in their head or intractable gastrointestinal bleeding who just cannot tolerate any anticoagulation. That's where you think about the Watchman. But the Watchman does have risks. There's risks of perforation of the heart when you put the thing in. There's risks that the device can embolize, meaning it travels and goes other places. Not a good thing. So there are small upfront risks. So you have to take those into account. And the last consideration is that just because you put a plug in the left atrial appendage doesn't mean you can't form a blood clot elsewhere in the left atrium that could also lead to stroke. So, and we know in amyloid patients that there's this entity where the atrium just doesn't contract very well, even in normal sinus rhythm, normal rhythm sometimes. So you have that kind of increased risk potentially of other blood clots in that part of the heart and the procedural risk. And on the flip side, that Eliquis is very safe. Most of us would prefer to put patients on anticoagulation. Now, I mean, unless they can't tolerate it. But I will kind of give the caveat that this is a kind of in evolution, and as we acquire more evidence whether the device is like helpful in amyloid patients, then we might reconsider. The last thing I'll say about Watchman is that it is still like, it's kind of a device that's really, it has its niche, but the principal treatment for patients with stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation remains anticoagulation until such data comes out to change that.
Okay, anything to add, Dr. Sperry?
I don't think so. I mean, I think to summarize, if you have legitimate bleeding, risk of bleeding, and you really can't take a blood thinner, like apixaban, like rivaroxaban, then a Watchman may be worth considering. But if you're kind of borderline or you just don't like taking it, then that's where it gets more hairy and may not be the best thing for you, or may not be indicated.
Yeah, well, I have one more Watchman question, and this is from Dave, and he says he's eligible to receive a Watchman. He's in permanent AFib, but he has a mild bleeding problem, nosebleed history. He's in addition to possibly being off blood thinners, he's highly interested in stroke prevention. So what would you say in a case like that how would his experience with Watchman be?
Well, I would say, that nosebleeding can be a significant problem, but it's also usually a treatable problem. It's something, usually if it really is, I just sent a patient to the ED like 3 weeks ago for pretty significant nosebleeding on Eliquis with ATTR cardiac amyloidosis, and he went in and he got it packed and had some local therapy, So, these things can be treated. I think what we're talking about, and my colleagues can, kind of add to this or correct me, we're talking about serious bleeding. And not that nosebleeding isn't serious, but it can be treated. Bleeding in the head often can't be treated. Something called chronic subdural hemorrhage, or arteriovenous malformations in the brain that are prone to bleeding. You really don't mess around with any bleeding inside the head. That's very serious. Or gastrointestinal bleeding, where patients continue to lose a lot of blood, and there's parts of the gastrointestinal tract that also can't be reached very well sometimes. And so, but nosebleeding, usually I would say, I would prefer that you try to take, Eliquis. I'd stop if you were on aspirin. You shouldn't be on that, or Plavix, or any of those other medicines. And that I would do like local things like, humidification. In my patient's problem, it was just really dry, and that was the problem. So things like humidification and, or seeing an ENT and actually having an examination and even a cauterization can solve that problem.
Okay. Here's a question about DMSO. D is in David, M is in Mary, S is in Sam, O is in obtuse. I have a question for the docs, and this is from Josie. I've heard rumblings about DMSO and amyloidosis. Is this info that can be addressed by the doctors? It sounds too good to be true. I'd like their take on protein support, Uniquely, DMSO helps stabilize and refold misfolded protein, yada, yada, yada. And then, so I never heard of it. So help me here. It helped her. Dr.
I've just read about it myself, Muriel. I know I think it's what dimethyl sulfoxide. It's a drug that or therapy that has been purported to, as you said, stabilize the abnormal protein. But I have not used it, so I personally don't have any experience. I apologize. I don't know if others have.
Dr. Ruberg?
No, I'm not aware of any application in amyloid disease or or cardiovascular disease for that matter, to be totally honest. It's kind of like I think people look for other potential in addition to the therapies that we have that we just talked about that are very expensive. And so far, we don't need to go down the whole kind of pathway of different naturopathic substances unless we want to talk about that. But I'm not, in this specific instance, DMSO, I would not recommend that you pursue that.
Okay, Dr. Sperry, any last comments on that?
No, I think the same comments. Before we had any proven therapies, we were giving people all sorts of things, including diflunisal if they could tolerate it, and EGCG, green tea extract and curcumin, turmeric, all this stuff that worked in test tubes and maybe worked in kind of small, non-rigorous studies. But when you have studies that are really rigorously proving that people are living longer and feeling better with the medications, and those are the ones that you have to prioritize.
And Dr. Karam, anything on DMSO from you? No? Okay. And people are still using diflunisal, Dr. Sperry, especially people that are on Amvuttra or on Patro or something, and they want to also be on a stabilizer, and maybe they can't get insurance to pay for tafamidis or one of the others that we hear a lot of people still on diflunisal. And I know Dr. Burke in the BU group is usually pretty pro diflunisal as long as you can work with the side effects. Any comment on that, Dr. Ruberg?
I think, Brett's totally right that diflunisal has really been relegated. It's not a historical drug like, say, EGCG. I can't say it. But we reserve it basically for, we can talk about that again in another part of the Q&A. It's not a first-line therapy, no question. You want to take an approved therapy that is, that's been, validated in rigorous, studies, just like Brett said. But for people, for example, who are variant carriers, who are very young, who are younger, who may have, some features that may want to, slow the development of disease, or people who have, say, amyloid in like a carpal tunnel specimen or a spinal stenosis specimen, but they don't have any other evidence of systemic disease and they tolerate the side effects. These are kind of the scenarios. These are like not studied, but theoretically potentially effective scenarios that we're now using diflunisal in. In the old days, even before tafamidis, it was our only therapy. Of course, it was never really rigorously tested in cardiac amyloidosis either, only as Sheikh mentioned in ATTR polyneuropathy. But it's definitely something that we still utilize in our center, but it is it's not for the first line therapy for sure.
Gotcha. Okay, we have and then we have variations of this question come up all the time. How do you monitor the disease? How is the progression of cardiac amyloidosis measured? What tests are done to confirm cardiac amyloid? I think they mean ATTR of the joints. They say cardiac amyloidosis of the joints, but they mean, so how do we monitor this? How do we measure this? I know this has been, we talk about measuring prealbumin, but so let's start with Dr. Sheikh, and then we'll move to Dr. Ruberg and Dr. Sperry and Dr. Karam.
I'm going to be briefer only because in the presence of Dr. Ruberg and Dr. Sperry, as it relates to ATTR-CM, they have great wisdom. So I'm just going to simply state that the progression of disease is something we are all in the field thinking very deeply about. I do not believe we have a consensus as to what the best practice is, but I do believe this is a very exciting time. I shared that one of the central figures from that article recently published in the European Heart Journal which I think nicely summarizes some of the really excitement about how we figure out what's best. We know from the clinical trials that measures of functional capacity are very helpful in looking at disease progression, and maybe actually better, clearly based on what we've learned about echocardiographic features of amyloid and whether they predict disease progression or improvement, we're realizing that actually functional capacity is very beneficial. So we at our center incorporate regularly 6-minute walk distance testing to guide us. That's one thing. But we now know through various centers, in no particular order, the National Amyloidosis Center in England and particularly in UK and London, where there has been the development of a staging system to prognostically tell us where you are in the disease state, and that serial measures of these blood tests, most notably a measure of kidney function known as eGFR, glomerular filtration rate, estimated glomerular filtration rate, and then one of the markers that I didn't do as good a job as I hoped to have done because of time, but NT-proBNP, a marker of remodeling in the heart, a measure of heart failure. These two biomarkers can be helpful in setting prognosis. There are others, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ruberg and Dr. Sperry. I have no doubt they'll have even better wisdom.
Well, I think I'll just take a piece of this, and I'll let Brett take another piece because he's published in the space, and Farooq kind of set the table really nicely. And since I'm the person who's the specialist in an echo and MRI imaging in this group, I might talk a little bit about imaging and the use of how you follow people with imaging. I'll just say, just a quick aside though, I'll say that you really need. So there's no consensus, first of all. Different centers do different things. And in terms of there's no consensus also on specific cut points. So Farooq nicely introduced a couple of really important concepts. Natriuretic peptides, which are heart-specific blood markers. What threshold do we choose to, that says that the drug is not working? Or eGFR, kidney function. What threshold do we choose to say that the drug is not, patients' hearts are getting worse? So these are not, we don't know the answers to these questions specifically. Those are things that we measure as well. But I also look at how do people feel? I mean, it's kind of the fundamental question. How are you feeling? Have you been in the hospital at all for your heart? Or have we had to augment your diuretic therapy over the past year? There's a lot of evidence around that. Augmentation of diuretic therapy. You need to take more, Lasix or more torsemide to keep you breathing comfortably. So these are kind of things, but it really comes down to how people feel. And we look at these other markers as kind of indicators that help us back up what we see about the patient in front of us. In respect to imaging, I do not repeat. So many patients, most patients with ATTR amyloidosis will get diagnosed with a PYP scan and or an MRI in 2025. And there is no data, there's no evidence that suggests that those scans should necessarily be repeated in terms of how you follow people. Now, PYP definitively, there's no evidence that suggests that repeating PYP scans in the absence of any major clinical change makes any sense. And most of PYP is kind of it's positive, and once it's positive, it stays positive. And our capacity to quantify, again, Brett could talk about this because he's a nuclear expert, but it's not something that we do on a regular basis. We just do it kind of once. And MRI, there is a good literature on MRI in AL amyloidosis following response to therapy. There isn't a very good literature on ATTR amyloidosis. And I'm part of some efforts to try to put all the data together and standardize that. But those papers haven't come out yet. But the bottom line is we still really don't. So echocardiography is kind of a different story. Now, our center, our practice is to get yearly echoes. Most of the time, those echoes don't change all that much if the patients feel totally the same. And so that's kind of a waste of time. I know at Mayo, Martha says that they don't repeat echoes unless people feel different. And I think that's a totally reasonable thing to do. So echo, on the other hand, is it's cheap. It really doesn't cost very much to patients, if anything, for copay usually. And you can't hurt anybody with ultrasound. So it's a low risk, easy thing to do. And sometimes it provides us as cardiologists some reassurance because we're actually seeing your heartbeat and we're measuring all the pressures non-invasively. But so I'm going to stop with that. So I'd say, okay to repeat echo, looking at the patient, kind of how do you feel? Have you been in the hospital? How can you walk? How many flights of stairs? The things that Farooq mentioned in terms of functional capacity, but I wouldn't repeat the other imaging tests. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Sperry.
Well, you guys have answered all of it basically. I mean, maybe I'll just summarize what I do, which sounds like exactly the same as what you guys do. I just want to reiterate and validate the question. I mean, like one of the number one questions I get, probably the number one question I get from a patient who's already been started on a treatment is, Doc, how do I know that this is working, right? Is there's like something you can do? If you have high blood pressure and you take a blood pressure medicine, your blood pressure comes down and you know it's working, right? But how do you know this is working? You don't really know, right? You know that the medication has worked in clinical trial format, but and you know that it's, so therefore you know that it's stabilizing the protein in your body, but patients, at least in the United States, maybe it's cultural, but they want like constant reassessment of where am I at in my current disease. And I think the biggest thing is just what the others have mentioned, which is how are you doing? You know, do you feel the same as you did 6 months ago, a year ago? What's your quality of life? We do a lot of the KCCQ quality of life spot checks in people, so we have a sense of where they are with respect to their symptoms of heart failure. Have they been hospitalized? Were they taking Lasix furosemide at 20 milligrams and now they're taking 60 milligrams, like Dr. Ruberg was talking about? I mean, some of these are signs of progression or things getting worse. Like Dr. Sheikh was saying, I do repeat cardiac biomarkers like this NT-proBNP, which has to do with stretch or strain on the heart. I repeat that, you know, on an annual basis, at least to kind of see where patients are, but that can fluctuate. You know, if you go and eat Chinese food the night before, the couple days before, like your NT-proBNP is going to be higher. You're going to be holding on to some salt. So, so that can even fluctuate. As far as imaging, I personally do the similar thing that I would with my other patients that have heart failure, which is if you're totally stable, I do repeat some sort of imaging, like in, you know, every couple years or something like that, either with an echo or an MRI. I've liked doing MRIs in people. You know, it's, at least at our center, it's pretty easy to get them. And it does have additional prognostic data in amyloidosis. So I've liked getting MRIs on these patients every couple years or something like that if they're stable. And obviously, if things are getting worse, then we look again to see if there are other things going on, usually with an echo. I also don't repeat the PYP or the HMVP scan, like the nuclear scans. There are several studies out there now showing that those scans can get better. The uptake in the heart of the nuclear agent can get better over time with various medicines, even just tafamidis, but definitely when there's combination of a stabilizer plus a silencer. But in those patients who've also had cardiac MRI, the MRI doesn't look too much different. So what's really going on? What is this PYP scan that we do, we don't really even know what it's binding to, because it's not binding to the amyloid like this AT01 or this evuzametide agent is, Dr. Wall's agent. That's binding to the amyloid fibril. The PYP scan is binding to something else. It's binding to probably microcalcifications that are around the amyloid fibrils. So my own opinion, that's backed by a little bit of data, is that I think I liken it to kind of like a more active form of amyloid and then a more inactive form of amyloid. So if you have a lot of tracer uptake, PYP tracer uptake in the heart, maybe you have more active deposition. And if you have lower amount of uptake or no uptake, maybe it's not as active anymore, but you still have the amyloid that is there that you can more easily quantify in the cardiac MRI. So maybe upcoming data will say that we should start doing more of these tests to follow patients, but right now we don't have good reason to do so.
Thank you. And Dr. Karam, you're kind of at a disadvantage measuring neuropathy. I know you mentioned the NIS score, the neuropathy impairment score, and I imagine you do a lot of quality of life things, but I mean, if someone has hereditary with polyneuropathy and they're on one of the silencer drugs, what do you use to measure if they're getting better? Just basically how they're feeling, or?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what's important, right? How the patient is feeling. So quality of life questionnaire, the one that we mentioned, the Norfolk, a lot of time this is just talking with the patient and asking them what's going on and what's bothering them. Obviously, our neurological examination shows if the neuropathy is getting worse or not. The nerve conduction study can be useful if there's new symptoms that arise, because it can help us differentiate between neuropathy or radiculopathy, meaning pinched nerve at the back, or carpal tunnel syndrome, which is a treatable condition with surgery. Ulnar neuropathy at the elbow, also treatable with surgery or with elbow pads, especially at night. And we we use those also in people who are asymptomatic, people who we are monitoring onset of disease. Obviously, if you have the variant, you want to very carefully monitor when the disease is starting. So we do repeat these testing. There is now the neurofilament light chain, which we have been using in research. Now it's also available to be checked in the labs commercially. So I've been doing that as well. And obviously, the TTR itself is a level that you can measure. Now, the issue is that if people are on both a silencer and a stabilizer, then it's very hard to interpret the level, because one increases the level, the other one lower it. So it's very hard. But if you're just purely on a silencer, it can tell me if the drug is working or not. I mean, I want to see this TTR go down as much as possible, because we in theory that is how the drug they work, and that's what we do. So all of these things are helpful to determine how the patient is doing. And obviously, whenever there's a new symptom that arise or anything like that, one, you want to make sure there's nothing else going on, because people have the right to get other illnesses that cause a problem. Like in our study, one of our study that we're doing, we have over 25% of patients who have diabetes, for example, which also cause a lot of problems, right? So you don't want to confuse the two disorder and blame everything on amyloid and then miss something that is treatable, like a vitamin deficiency or a pinched nerve. So, but yes, we're not as lucky with imaging as the cardiologists with the echo and etc. But we do have other ways to monitor the disease as well.
Ask you, Dr. Karam, have you had any or many or some instances where a patient started off in really bad shape with peripheral neuropathy and maybe even were in a wheelchair or difficult to walk, needed a walker, and then after being on one of the silencers for a certain amount of time, you saw such a big improvement, they no longer needed the wheelchair or the walker, or they were able to write better holding a pen? Have you seen any instances like that?
Unfortunately, no. That is, and again, that's why we are all very, I think everybody has said the same thing. We have to diagnose people early and start treatment early, because the nerve damage, once it happened, again, it doesn't, a lot of time it doesn't recover. So that unfortunately doesn't happen. I mean, we had some instances in mild neuropathy where the pain has improved, or the diarrhea has improved, or even the orthostatic hypotension, meaning the lightheadedness when they stand up because the blood pressure is dropping, has also improved. But if somebody is in a wheelchair or have using the walker, or they have a foot drop, from the neuropathy, and they have atrophy, that's one of the things. If you have atrophy, it's very hard to gain that back. So we have to be realistic. But I think things, it's rare now. I think we're diagnosing people earlier and earlier, and which is a good thing in the neurology world.
Okay, so here's a question for you, Dr. Karam, from George. Given that amyloid ATTR can cause muscle strains and ruptures, biceps, hamstrings, adductors, etc., what can be done to treat and prevent this from happening? So would there be anything that they can do if they have ATTR to keep the ruptures from happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Again, it depends on when the diagnosis was made. Has it been made when there's already been amyloid deposited in tendon and made it weak? then it's unfortunately the current treatment are not going to probably help much. So you have to treat early and make sure these complications don't happen, because once they happen, unfortunately, it's a little bit more difficult to control them.
Hey, we've got a couple of questions on the depleters. Okay. My understanding, this is from Jim. I'm writing to inquire about the latest advancements in treating cardiac removal of protein from the heart muscle. He understands there's several approaches. I know that we did have some presentations on them earlier from Dr. Sperry. And he wants to know, maybe we can go into reiterate on some of those trials, maybe for the depleters for Jim. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria on those trials to see who might qualify that's listening in today?
Sure. I could take that. So, and there was a message in either the chat or the questions that you sent me, Muriel, about the this AT01 trial, the phase 1 trial. So that phase 1 trial is closed right now. Phase 1 is nice in a way because everyone's guaranteed to get the medication, but it is the downside is that it's a very early phase trial, so they really have not tested it in that many patients, and so we're kind of learning on the job to see what's going to happen when we infuse patients with this medication. The phase 3 trial, and you can go on clinicaltrials.gov with the Alexion or AstraZeneca product, the ALXN2220. That one is open right now around the country. It's a 2-to-1 randomization. So for every 3 people, 2 will get the medication and 1 will not get the medication. And we're all blinded, so no one knows who's who. For that, you have to have ATTR cardiomyopathy. You can't have, any abnormal light chains or anything like that. You have to, if you do, then you have to have proof of amyloid and ATTR in the heart with a heart biopsy. And then there's a cutoff for the NT-proBNP that is a little bit higher. So they're trying to find patients who are sicker for these trials because the companies feel, and it makes sense, that the patients are sicker who will derive the most benefit as far as the amount of amyloid that's in the heart that can be removed. And also when you're making a clinical trial, you need there to be enough events over the period of time, right? So if you're following people for 3 years or 2.5 years, and you want to show that the medication helps people live longer, well, you have to have enough people who are not living or dying during that period of time in order to show that your medication wins out over the placebo. Similarly, hospitalizations and these other types of things. So they are trying to get people who are sicker, so that are more likely to have these outcomes, these negative outcomes without treatment. So all these trials are trying to find patients that are sicker. So there's inclusion and exclusion criteria with age. I think the age goes up to 90, and we're diagnosing patients later and later now. And so it's nice to have that age, but this is for cardiomyopathy specific, and not specifically for polyneuropathy, though we are measuring some polyneuropathy findings in some of these studies. But ultimately they're cardiomyopathy studies.
So you're looking for maybe stage 3 or stage 4 cardiac? I know in the AL depleter trials, they were looking for stage 3 and stage 4.
Yes. It's not, the inclusion is not based on the stage, but it's based on there's a million inclusion and exclusion criteria, but the main one that trips patients up the most is the NT-proBNP, which is in the staging system, the stage 1, 2, and 3 of the National Amyloidosis Center. So yes, they do want patients with higher NT-proBNPs to get into those studies. At least the Alexion study, I'm not sure about. The other ones have not sort of released what their inclusion and exclusion criteria are, but the concept in talking to them is the same, that we're trying to find patients who are sicker, who've recently, within the past year, been in the hospital for heart failure, received IV diuretic like Lasix or Bumex. They are not, unfortunately, it's hard for my patients who have been really stable for like 3 or 4 years on tafamidis. They usually don't meet the criteria, you know, because they're very stable on a medication. They haven't been in the hospital recently, and their NT-proBNP is lower. So it seems like the more newly diagnosed patients are the ones that it's a little bit easier to get to be able to include in these trials.
And can they be these people that qualify for the trial that have pretty high levels of NT-proBNP or are pretty sick? Can they be on Amvuttra or you know, whatever the drug Wainua, whatever? Can they be on the Attruby? Can they be on these?
Yes.
And still be on the trial?
Yes. Yeah. They have to be stable. They have to be at stable doses, I think, for a month of either a stabilizer or a silencer or both for the depleter trials. Now, the trial that's the CRISPR therapy, the one-time treatment, this NextZ trial that we have available. This is down the silencer pathway as well. So you can't be on vutrisiran or eplontersen and also be in that trial. So those patients are excluded. But for the depleters, at least for the Alexion one, which I'm more aware of because we're in that one and it's the most advanced one, you can be on one or both of those classes.
Okay, great. Okay, pacemaker question. Okay. My question for your distinguished panel is, can you discuss the indications for and effectiveness of the new wireless implantable pacemaker for ATTR-VCM, or I think they meant ATTR-CM? Dr. Sheikh.
Thank you so much. The therapy that our colleague broached for the group is one that I actually getting more and more frequently from our patients. Conceptually, the idea is that a device implanted within the heart that allows you to pace without a wire, without a lead, is beneficial for some patients to reduce the risk of the complications associated with it, one of which, of course, is infection, which can be a bloodstream infection and can be quite serious. The challenge, of course, and why I can't give you a definitive answer is that in ATTR-CM, the conduction disease is affected. Obviously, the heart globally and the body, arguably globally, is affected by amyloidosis. The deposits of amyloidosis that occur within the interstitium or the extracellular matrix affect the conduction system. And the conduction system is quite complex, actually. It starts in certain organized group of cells in the right atrium, the upper right chamber of the heart, called the SA node, then propagates and coordinates to a sort of a middle house called the AV node, and then down to the lower pumping chambers of the heart. And the challenge here is that depending on what the cause of the disease is, meaning where does the electrical problem exist, the therapy that we're discussing is different, meaning some individuals can just have a problem in the near the upper chamber. The conduction problem is mostly focused in the atria, and they can have a pacemaker implanted in the atrium because the rest of the electrical system is healthy and intact. And so that's reasonable. That risk is lower in terms of the complications related to it. You might imagine what they are: perforation of the heart, bleeding, infection risk very low. So I would say that's the real advantage. But also dislodgement of the lead, meaning the lead, God forbid, or sorry, that the wireless pacemaker can get dislodged, and then you have to extract it, which could, sometimes be a cardiac surgery, etc. Now, this is juxtaposed to that where patients need two wireless pacemakers, one in the atria and one in the ventricle. And that risk with the ventricular pacemaker is a little more complicated. Again, analogous to what we were talking about with the Watchman device, I haven't yet seen definitive data, though I think people are undoubtedly thinking about this. I have personally not been advising my patients to pursue it until we have a little more data because of the fear regarding, again, this idea that the conduction system in amyloidosis is globally affected and that you might put a pacemaker lead in the upper chamber and you feel good about it, but you're just really not treating the major problem, which is that the rest of the conduction disease will likely be at some point affected. And this progression of disease and the indication for pacemakers, which I didn't discuss, was this idea that people have symptoms of breathlessness, or God forbid they faint, or they feel like they might faint, usually because they have very slow heart rates. Then other patients have the confluence of very fast heart rates for atrial fibrillation or other upper chamber of the heart arrhythmias, combined with very slow heart rates. This what they call tachybrady syndrome or tachycardia bradycardia syndrome. So the answer is we really don't know what's the best treatment. I think there probably is a role for certain patients early in the disease state, but I will tell you in my patient population, the one I'm lucky enough to take care of, I don't routinely offer it or recommend it. I work closely with our electrical doctors who are much more expert, and they can then guide us as to what to do. And sorry, I gave you a long-winded answer. I have no doubt Rick and Brett have dealt with this many times as well.
Okay, any other comments, Dr. Ruberg, Dr. Sperry?
I think I just distill, what Farooq said, just down to kind of like a couple of points, because he answered the question very kind of eloquently as usual. So first, there's not like a lot of things. There's not a lot of experience in amyloid patients with these new they're called leadless pacemakers. Number two, the leadless pacemakers that have been introduced initially were just pacing from the bottom part of the heart. Now we have the capacity to pace the top and the bottom of the heart. The problem is that we don't know what the optimum way to pace the heart is in cardiac amyloidosis, meaning that there is a school of thought that if patients are reliant on those pacemakers, they should have something called a CRT or cardiac resynchronization therapy or biventricular pacemaker, which is a different type of pacemaker, which you can't achieve, as far as I know, with the leadless pacemaker system yet. And so, I think it really kind of comes down to, again, a discussion between why is a patient getting the pacemaker? Why do they need it? Number two, how much do they expect to be paced? And then number three, what's the heart rhythm doctor, the electrophysiologist able to implant? The advantages of the leadless system are, as Farooq mentioned, in the fact that there's a lower risk of bloodstream infection, and cosmetically you don't have like a device sitting here in your shoulder, but the trade-off for that might be a less effective device for that particular patient. You know what I mean? Not the devices aren't effective. So it's kind of a nuanced answer.
Yeah. Dr. Sperry, anything to add? Okay, my internet connection is unstable, or I'm unstable, one or the other, okay? We'll ask this quick. Okay, comorbidities. How will having a comorbidity like a high-grade prostate cancer affect my hereditary TTR treatment and my overall progress? Do I now have too many battles on my hands? Dr. Sperry.
Yeah, I could, when we were talking about, during this conversation, it made me think of our patients that are stable with ATTR-CM now. Most of my office visits with them are talking about other things, right? Talking about prostate cancer that comes up, or talking about back pain and spinal stenosis, and they're having surgery. I mean, I think 3 of my 10 patients in one of these trials have had back surgery during the trial. Like, it's just that, but this is what we're sort of hoping for, in a way, to turn this amyloidosis into a chronic type disease where patients are stable from their cardiovascular standpoint. But, other things do crop up in life, like cancers and like orthopedic issues and other types of things. So, we need to work through that with patients. It can be a lot when you're dealing with multiple things going on. As far as prostate cancer specifically, there's no real connection between the amyloidosis and the prostate cancer. But you know, if patients need surgery, it's something that needs to be discussed with your cardiologist to risk stratify what's your risk of your cardiac risk of undergoing surgery, this type of thing. But that's my overall comment on this, that more and more patients are you know, experiencing other non-amyloid problems as we continue to diagnose patients earlier and stabilize their cardiac issues.
What about the fact that he's on Amvuttra and he's on tafamidis? Will that be contraindicated with any treatment that he needs for prostate cancer, or will that affect him going into surgery or anything?
I don't really think so. I mean, there's no real contraindications to these medications. You know, side effects are similar to the placebo side effects in the trials. We haven't anecdotally seen patients have any major issues with these. So it should be okay. Obviously, talk to your doctor, et cetera, but I don't see a real reason why that would be problematic.
Okay, well, we have about 50 questions we did not get to. Okay, so I will be sending them to our brilliant physicians here on the panel, and we'll give you a few hours. No, we'll give you a few days to get back to us with responses, and then we will share them with the group, because some of them are really quite interesting. And we always promise our patients we'll get everyone answered. So, and I want to thank you all. I realize that this is a Saturday afternoon. You all are very young. You probably have wonderful families and children and wives. And so we appreciate your taking time away for us. And we thank you again. And we'll be seeing you at a meeting or a webinar or something really soon. So thank you all so very much. Remember, everyone, please fill out that survey when you leave.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much.